Go ahead.
Okay, everybody, welcome to the webinar with Ash Maurya. We are so glad that you could join us for this webinar, and we are particularly thankful to Ash for his time that he has taken out to train us today. Before we turn the time over to Ash, I wanted to, again, on behalf of the International Business Model Competition, remind you about some important things regarding the competition. Just so you're aware, my name is Jeff Brown. I am the director of the International Business Model Competition. And so here on the screen, you will see, let me see here, Ash, do I have control to go to the next slide? There we go. Okay. We have a few important dates, again, that we want to make sure that all of you throughout the world are aware of. So there on the screen, you can see the at-large round submission deadline is at the end of March. That is an online submission, and your video is up to 8 minutes explaining the validation that you have done on your business idea. And again, that's due before 11:59 p.m. Mountain Standard Time. So just make sure to note of that Mountain Standard Time for when you submit your at-large round submission. We know many of you are competing in qualifier competitions, and some of those qualifier competitions, the final event happens after the at-large round submission deadline. So because of that, we encourage you to submit to the at-large round knowing that you might not win your qualifier competition in a spot in the final global competition. So we encourage teams anywhere from any accredited university to submit to the at-large round for your chance to fill some additional slots in the global finals. The at-large round winners will be announced on Thursday, April 11th. And then for those who are chosen for the at-large round, we have pre-competition mentoring. We do this for all of our everyone who qualifies for the global competition. But for those who are at large, from Thursday, April 11th through Thursday, April 25th, that is the 2-week period that you will receive, you will get connected to and receive mentoring from a pre-competition mentor. So we will also have a FAQ session live on our Facebook page on Thursday, April 25th. That's kind of a chance for us as a team to answer any last questions that any of you who are among the 40 global finalists to, again, answer all of your questions. We won't take time during this webinar to do that. And then, of course, our global event and the global competition will take place on Thursday, May 9th and Friday, May 10th. So that's really all I wanted to cover. And again, a man who needs no introduction, Ash, I will turn the time back over to you. Thank you so much.
All right, thank you, Jeff. Let me switch things over. All right, so welcome everyone. Just by way of introduction, I often like to point out that I'm a practicing entrepreneur. I've built many, many products over the years and still do. So a lot of the things I'll be sharing with you are just battle tested kind of lessons learned. So I get a lot of questions about, what would I do differently? I would stop doing a lot of the things that I used to do and start doing some of the things that we'll be talking about today. And that's been just a learning process. So for me, I'm still constantly learning, and that's what you will kind of see in some of the work here today. So before we get started with content, I did want to cover a couple of just logistics issues. I already saw one question posted, so I think you guys don't need much of an intro in the interface, but you should all see my slides. You should all see at the very bottom, there are 3 buttons there. There's a chat button, raise hand, and Q&A. So we're going to ignore the raise hand button. That's just a way for you to get attention. So we're not going to be doing that on this call, but feel free to use the chat as you have for just general discussion, any general questions that you have or chatting amongst yourself. That's what the chat is. We've got a number of folks from the competition, Abigail, Austin, and Jeff, who will be watching that and kind of answering those types of general good questions. Any questions you want to direct at me, it would be easier to use the Q&A button so it doesn't get lost in the chat thread. That way I can, at the end, kind of look at everything that's been asked. And I know Abigail and Jeff and team are also going to be be just helping moderate that. So if you are going to ask a question, feel free to do that with the Q&A. Use the chat for general kind of chat stuff, and that's kind of what those interfaces will look like. Okay, so with that, let's kick things off. So I often like to set some context on why we are here, and this may be kind of a little bit of review for some of you, and then we'll get into more of the tactical stuff that we're here to talk about. But as you can see from the slide, we have built products over the years many different ways. Many of us were not really alive back in the 1950s, I'm guessing, but I like to share this slide because a lot of what we kind of in some ways come full circle. A lot of what we are talking about with Lean Startup had its roots all the way down in Lean Manufacturing. So you can kind of see there's a bunch of different things that have happened along the way, and some of you may be familiar with these processes of building. This slide begins to summarize what I think are the fundamental differences. So if you kind of look at this, there are a bunch of, there's a legend at the top right, but what I'm essentially trying to communicate here is that product development goes through a set of stages. There are some well-known stages. We have to gather requirements, we have to build products, we have to then release them to customers and do market validation. In the traditional way of building products, or in the older way of building products, we would spend a lot of time doing requirements and even more time doing builds. And that was what you saw with Waterfall. As we got into Agile, we began to go faster. And as we got into Lean Startup and continuous innovation, the reason I call it continuous is because you can see from the imagery there, it's all the little legend kind of all compressed together, all the different icons in the legend all compressed together. And that is fundamentally what's different around here, is that we're going a lot faster than we have ever before. And that has become the new unfair advantage. So things like Waterfall, Agile used to work at a time when there were fewer competition in the marketplace. So a company could afford to build a product once, get it completely wrong, and then still build version 2, version 3, and the customers had nowhere to go. And so they would just iterate with their customers and then eventually get it right. And these are sometimes 2-3 year cycle times. Today, we are living in this global entrepreneurial renaissance, which you can witness right here on the call. There are people from all over the world, and that has changed a lot of things. And so in terms of unfair advantages, the new unfair advantage today is fundamentally about speed of learning. If you can outlearn your competition, you stand to win. If you can do that once, you get market attention. If you can do that continuously, then you get to build what customers want. You stay relevant to customers, your business model grows, and that's what this is all about. Now, I use the word continuous because oftentimes we'll see a lot of people start out with the process and then it's back to business as usual. And so that's kind of a key point to raise, is that this is very much of a continuous mindset. It's a continuous process. Now, if you notice in the timeline in the previous slide, a lot of Lean startups showed up on the scene late 2009, early 2010. And I was just looking at the calendar the other day in one of my workshops, and I realized that we're almost 10 years later. So it's almost, next year is going to be the 10-year anniversary. So this stuff has been around for a long time, yet we still find people picking this up for the first time or not really practicing this in the way that they should. And so the question we always have to ask is, why is that? And that's in some ways, or that's what I want to kind of highlight today, is some of the pitfalls, kind of roadblocks for practicing this. You're all in this competition. You're all kind of familiar with the general principles. And I want to kind of go a bit deeper on them. So I'll cover some of the highlights that I see. So I'll be judging here in May. And one of the things that, or some of the things I want to point out are some of the things that I'll be looking at in many of the ideas that are being presented. And then along the way, we'll kind of open up for questions. So if you have any particular questions on what something means, feel free to start putting those in the Q&A section. So why isn't everyone doing this? Fundamentally, it's about new mindset, skills, and playbooks that are different. To give you a flavor of what some of those things are, is that whenever we have gone from an old way of doing things to a new way of doing things, there are things that we have to unlearn, things that even you might learn in school if you went to a computer science program, or you went to an engineering program, mechanical engineering, or any kind of product-oriented discipline, they're kind of, many of those processes are still built in traditional waterfall. And what we're talking about here is going really fast. And so there are a lot of mindsets that have to go along with that, like giving yourself permission to scale, thinking of a business model as the product, starting with problem, not solution. So rather than walk through the slide, which will be pretty plain and dry, I'm going to kind of illustrate that with some examples as we go along the way. Some of the skills that we'll be talking about here are going to be kind of this mindset of business modeling versus planning. So versus business planning, thankfully, you don't have to write a business plan. I still know many people who unfortunately do, but we'll be talking about kind of what the differences are and how to look at business models. Business models are kind of snapshots, and they're very different from business plans. And then we'll be talking about kind of playbooks and rollouts and things. So again, we'll illustrate that more with some of the content to come. This is just a kind of an overview of what some of those things are that I'm talking about. So this in many ways summarizes kind of the traditional waterfall type of mindset, analyze. So let's go and come up with an idea. Let's analyze it to no end. Let's plan, and then let's execute that plan. Again, it worked at a time, and I'm not going to say it was the wrong thing to do. That at the time was the right approach to building products. But in the new world, for some of the reasons that I've touched on, we're going much faster, and as a result, there's a lot more uncertainty. When there's a lot more uncertainty, it's very hard to come up with a perfect plan, and so we have to instead come up with a dynamic model that can be iterative, that can be modified, that can be more adaptive along the way. The other principle that you will see here is that we are really searching for ideas. It isn't, many of you have been working on ideas, and hopefully you have seen both validation and a lot of invalidation, and all of that is par for the course. The best way to find the next big idea is by continuously testing lots of ideas. And so this is that search versus execution mindset. So it's perfectly normal to go through lots of invalidation, and doing it fast is really what's fundamentally going to get you to a model that works before we run out of resources. So the high-level process for doing that is this three-step process. This is the one slide that I use to kind of summarize what this process looks like. We'll also kind of use this to dive deeper into each of these steps. So that's kind of the agenda slide as well. So at the far left, we are going to be talking about modeling. So you take an idea, you create a business model. I'll kind of talk about what is a business model, and some of you may know that from the canvas, but I want to go a bit further today and talk about really another aspect of a business model that's sometimes not talked as much. We then want to talk about how you prioritize what's riskiest in the model, and then finally what testing means and how you communicate your results at the very end. And then we'll open up for questions, and anything is fair game. So first step, start with a business model. So what is a business model? This is the definition that I like the most. So a business model is essentially a story about your company, about your idea, that describes how you create, deliver, and capture value. And this is all with relative to customers, right? So let's talk about how we create, deliver, and capture value. If you can communicate that, that gets your idea across. That's kind of what a business model is fundamentally about. Now, there are two ways that we are going to be using in the competition to capture this. There's the lean canvas, and that's what that one looks like. And then there's the business model canvas. And I guess you're open to use either one, whatever you're comfortable with. People often like to know what the differences are between those, so I kind of put this slide with an overlay of the two. The lean canvas, I'm biased because I created the lean canvas. It is a derivative off of the business model canvas. And my goal with creating the lean canvas was not trying to create necessarily something better, but rather something different. It comes with a different paradigm. So if you look at the business model canvas, it traditionally talks about things like who are your partners going to be, what are the key activities you're going to do, what are the key resources. I find that at the earliest stages of an idea, some of those things are simply unknowable, especially when you're starting as an entrepreneur, trying to create something out of nothing. So I took a different perspective. I start with a customer problem solution type of thinking. That's what we use to de-risk the business model in the early days, and you'll kind of see that in some more slides to come. And that's what's fundamentally different. So again, inherently, one isn't necessarily better than the other. They're just two different paradigms, and it's perfectly okay to pick the one that you're more comfortable with, you're more natural with. In these slides, I'm going to favor the lean canvas because, again, we have built a whole framework around that, and I'll kind of talk through that. But you can kind of insert the business model canvas just as easily in many of those instances. Okay, so if we look at the job of a business model, create, deliver, and capture value. So how do we do that? So if you are using a lean canvas, value creation is really fundamentally about how do you craft your unique value proposition? What's different about your idea? How do you create value for your customers? To be able to create a compelling unique value proposition, it has to be narrow and specific. To be able to narrow it down, you have to identify your customer segments, you have to identify your early adopters, and that's how you narrow down a unique value proposition. If a unique value proposition is too broad and you're trying to talk to everyone, you end up talking to no one. So that's why it's very important to kind of in the earlier stages of your idea, try to make your unique value proposition narrow by narrowing down on those customer segments. How do you make it specific? That's by going deeper on problems. So if you can describe a problem better than your customers, you gain a superpower. Imagine you go to a doctor's office and the doctor diagnoses you, they gain a superpower. If they give you a prescription, you want to go apply it. That's the same thing that happens in marketing. If you can describe a problem better than your customers, that creates a superpower where your unique value proposition becomes a lot more compelling because it has trust. Customers believe you. They think if you understand the problem, surely you have to have a solution. So that's why I emphasize a lot of this deep problem understanding, which is why there's a whole big box for it. And again, we'll dive into the problem and customer segments boxes here just a little bit in a further slide. If we shift to the second job of the business model, this is delivery of value. How do we deliver value? This is where you start talking about things like your solution, things like your channels. Those are distribution kind of delivery mechanisms, and then things about your cost structure. So value delivery typically has a cost associated with it. So that's where you can talk about these three boxes. And then finally, you have your revenue streams, and this is where you capture value. It's just a fancy way of saying getting paid. Now, I've seen a lot of canvases over the years, and oftentimes this is probably the box that people defer to later, but this is also one of the more riskier boxes. So that's just something I'll throw out there, is that if you have a canvas in the early days, it's fine not to know where your revenue is going to come from, but you need to quickly get to that. Definitely by the time you're in the competition, you need to quickly be able to identify who is your customer. If you have a multi-sided model, who are your customers, who are your users, so who are the ones paying you, and even what is that ballpark pricing? So what is that price point? Because a lot of that is going to help us in sizing the potential impact or the potential size of your idea. So that's kind of traditional kind of canvas modeling. So again, the whole idea of the canvas is that it helps you deconstruct an idea, put it on a single page, helps you communicate it very easily. And if you can describe these three things, everything else people can read and kind of understand. If they have questions, they tend to ask. But if you can focus your description of your idea around value creation, so who is the customer, what's the problem, what's the unique value proposition, that's value creation. How do you deliver that value? So how do you solve for that problem? So what does your solution look like? How do you get it to market? And then finally, you can talk about cost structure. Is what you're doing feasible? So that's how you talk about value delivery. And then finally, value capture. So what you're doing, is it monetizable? Are you going to charge money? Who is going to pay? And how much are they going to pay? So generally, that's what a business model is. So nothing complex really about it if we kind of simplify it around those three jobs. So I wanted to insert this section here. This is not going to be part of the judging rules this time around, so you can choose to completely ignore this. But I was in the competition last year, and one of the feedback that I gave to the organizers and to other judges was that I kind of struggled in some of the pitches to get a sense of the size of the idea, to get a sense of, is this a big enough idea worth doing? And this is where, even in some of the work that I've been working on, one of the things that I've realized is that a business model canvas, a lean canvas, is not enough when you are trying to talk to investors. And many of you are, in this for those reasons. Some of you might go on to raise investment, in the not so distant future. And so the thing to realize is that you do need to produce more artifacts than just the business model story and the validation story. So you may have run a bunch of experiments, but when you go and talk to investors, they are in this for one reason and one reason alone, and that's to get a return on investment. So one of the questions that they often like to understand or ask is, how will you measure success? And how big of a success could this be? Because I want to do the math behind the scenes and see if I can get an ROI on my investment. So they only do this for the reason of giving you an investment, and sometime in the future, you need to give them a multiplier back. You need to give them that return on investment. So oftentimes when we talk about this from an investor perspective, I'm throwing this in here. So this is kind of, as I said, bonus material. If you include this in your pitches in the competition, it will only help your case. And I think we will start to, in the future competitions, start to introduce more of this. But this year, again, as I said, this is just a bonus piece that I'm going to throw out here, just to prepare you for what happens after the competition. So again, when you're talking to investors, they want to know, how big is this idea? Some traditional ways for doing this is, let's just pick a big market. So this is your classic top-down sizing or slicing of pie. You might say, I'm in a $1 billion market. The software industry is a $1 billion industry. If I take 1% of it, that's a big opportunity. The problem with that is that doesn't give me any sense that you can actually take 1% of the idea. It kind of creates this illusion of market sizing, market validation, and it generally doesn't fly anymore. That used to be the traditional way of saying, I'm going after a big market. I just need a small market share, and I've got a big enough idea, but that generally doesn't work. So that's just something to keep in mind. The other side of it is, a lot of this kind of judging criteria is really about learning. But when investors look at your business, they don't care that much about learning. I mean, they want you to learn. They want you to learn about your markets. But more importantly, they want you to apply that learning towards business model results. And that is what this is fundamentally about. So learning by itself, not a measure of success when it comes to your stakeholders. They will happily look at what you have done, but then they're going to ask you about kind of the bottom line. Is this, again, a big enough idea? Can you show me evidence of that? This is where, again, many investors today, even because they don't have any other tools to ask for this kind of these kind of metrics, they often get people into doing the forecasting, into showing them the spreadsheets. The problem with those kinds of exercises is that people end up drowning in lots and lots of numbers. I don't know if any of you on the call have ever tried to build a financial forecast, but it's very easy to build a very fantastical model that looks amazing. The reality doesn't always play to that, and so that's some of the challenges with doing this kind of modeling with the spreadsheet. So what I will introduce here is just another tool that, again, if you're inclined, you can go and dig deeper and research it. If not, if you're kind of busy with everything else and have too much on your plate, you can kind of ignore this section. But fundamentally, when you are trying to get to talk to investors, we need to standardize on a single metric. What typically happens is you see this dichotomy of progress stories. Is investors want one thing, they want to see things like profit and revenue in the business. Entrepreneurs, on the other hand, cannot show that in the early days because you're going through this lean startup process. It's small scale. You're probably getting handfuls of validation. So how do you really communicate the story? Anyone have any ideas what's the answer to this question? So what is it that both investors and entrepreneurs fundamentally want, other than money? And feel free to type it in the chat window. Returns, customer expectations. Okay, so returns is good. So returns on investment, absolutely. Social impact, I guess, depends on the investor. Low risk, yes. There we go, traction. That's the word I was looking for. and not because the other answers aren't right, but at the end of the day, this is what gets investors really excited. So product market fit, but even that's just a stage. Product market fit is, so things like profit, revenue, all those things are important. Social impact. If you have a social investor, they care about that. But ultimately, what they care about is a growing rate of return. So not even a good product market fit, or not even profit, because you may be profitable, and we see this happening all the time in Wall Street. A company is profitable one quarter, but the next quarter they're reporting losses. That doesn't make investors happy. Investors want to see a company go through this trajectory, because that's what promises them increasingly higher rates of return, and that's what makes them go yay. So notice I don't even label the y-axis. If I walk into an investor's office with a graph like this, they're going to sit me down, because I'm going to create a Pavlovian response in them, and they're going to want to understand everything about my business. So I don't even have to lead with the canvas. I don't even have to lead with the idea. I just have to say, here's my traction graph, and that's going to start the conversation. So that's the point that I want to raise here, is that above everything else, investors want traction, but that should also be what you as entrepreneurs want. You want to see traction in your idea, because traction is fundamentally what is going to prove that the business model is working. So if you look at a definition here of what is traction, I define it as the rate at which a business model captures monetizable value from its customers. Why monetizable value? Because oftentimes, again, if you're working in a direct business model, like say a Starbucks, where you have coffee that you're selling, their traction is literally the amount of value you're creating for your customers that result in you getting paid. And that's easy to kind of see. So their monetizable value is kind of close to revenue, but it's even before revenue. So before Starbucks customers pay you any money, they have to consume the coffee. The coffee has to be good. If it's not good, they're going to spit it out and ask for their money back. So to me, it's not so much the revenue. The revenue comes at the very end. It really is that consumption of coffee. So the amount of coffee cups that Starbucks can actually sell, the amount of customers that they can create, the direct model is traction. So in a direct model, that's kind of simple. If we look at multi-sided models, like a Facebook story, it gets a bit more complex, but even then you have a user side and you have a customer side. The way we define traction in these cases is going to be by talking about both of these sides. And you don't need hundreds and hundreds of numbers. So to prove that, if you actually go to Facebook's website and look at how they communicate to their investors, they only talk about two metrics here. So the way Facebook's model works is that they produce something valuable for their users. They give it away for free, but there's no such thing as a free user. We, in exchange, those of us that use Facebook, are giving them our data. We're giving them their attention, and then they monetize that with their true customers, which ends up being advertisers in this case. So there are only two numbers that you really need to report on if you want to report traction. And if you can report to both of these numbers, and both of these numbers are healthy, your stakeholders are super happy. So one of them is the size of the user base, the size of the asset. So this would be your daily active users, and this is the case in Facebook. If you don't have a product that's used daily, but maybe monthly or seasonally, then you would kind of use that seasonal activity as a way to gauge this. But if that usage is growing, that's a leading indicator of traction. And so you don't need to even generate revenue to show that there's something valuable here. So that's the first side of the story, but the monetization side is just as important. The way that Facebook communicates this is by taking their daily active user number, taking how much advertising dollars that they produce that quarter, and dividing the two. So the revenue they produce from advertising, dividing by the average number of users, gives you an average revenue per user. And so even though you and I don't pay necessarily Facebook directly, just by using Facebook, they are indirectly getting money from us. So we actually have a value in the system that they can place, and that's the value that you see in these graphs. So when you are talking to a stakeholder, when you plot these two graphs and both these numbers are going up and to the right, which you're seeing here in some of these instances, that's very, very exciting. Investors are super, super happy. Even if one of these numbers goes up and to the right, that's good news. So the point of this is that for your business model type, think about what your traction metric is. So if it's a direct model, it tends to be what are customers doing that's going to produce a monetizable event in your business model. In the Starbucks case, it was buying coffee. in the Facebook's case, it was on the user side using the service, so coming back every day, so engagement, retention, daily active usage, that's all good. And then on the monetization side, it was the conversion to the customer, which in this case was the advertiser. Google does a similar model. It doesn't always have to be advertising based. You might be producing a lot of data. It's a big data play that you then sell to a health insurance company or to a risk, kind of management company. There are all kinds of models here where data can also be sold. But similarly, there's a derivative asset here. You're producing something from the user side, which you then sell to the customer side. And then the last example that I would give here is your last archetype of a business model, which is your traditional marketplace, like Airbnb, Etsy, what else? I guess eBay is another marketplace example. And in all of these cases, the difference here is that you have buyers and sellers, and they are coming together to conduct a transaction. And that becomes the moment when you're creating value in the system. So that becomes a moment when you're capturing value as well. That's when you get paid. So here there's only one metric that really matters. So if you have a marketplace model, the one metric that you want to plot, and if you can plot a graph like this one, this is an amazing graph. It started out slow in the case of Airbnb, but they eventually are now renting out more guest nights than all the top 5 hotel chains combined. And that is how they communicate traction. They don't have to talk about anything else to their investors. If this number keeps going up and to the right, the stakeholders are super, super happy. So the whole point of this section is that you kind of want to identify your North Star metric. So in the key metrics box on your lean canvas, for instance, you want to identify what is the one metric for your business model that if that number is going up and to the right, your investors are going to be super happy and you're going to be super happy. And it has to be something that kind of aligns with value capture, not just kind of value creation, because you may have a instance like Snapchat in the early days where they were getting lots of value for their users, but they couldn't monetize that. And again, that doesn't communicate a ROI story. So that's kind of what you want to think about. Now, how do we model traction? I talked about Excel spreadsheets. That's kind of where people can frown in a set of numbers. There are too many numbers on that spreadsheet, sometimes hundreds of numbers. Somebody once described that as a layer of lies that just compound on each other. If you ever try to do those spreadsheets, it's very tempting to start plugging a bunch of numbers. And then, as I said, pretty quickly, you end up with a very fantastical model, and you have to ratchet it down. And that's not serving anyone, because at the end of the day, you're just playing around with numbers, not really understanding what the inputs are, just kind of playing with the output to see how do I get to my hockey stick that the investor is interested in. A much more healthier approach is not starting with a spreadsheet, but starting with 7 metrics. Now, again, I'm not going to walk through these. If you want to get into more details, I'll talk about this at the end on how you can learn a little bit more about these metrics. Some of you may know the metrics in the center there if you're familiar with the Pirate metrics or the R metrics. If you've kind of run into that in the Lean Startup body of work, you've probably seen some of that. But fundamentally, these 7 metrics are what we can use to start creating a different kind of model. So the business model canvas, the lean canvas, helps to tell the qualitative side of the story. It helps to describe who your customers are, what you're going to go do, and it kind of, you can tell that, you can do storytelling around it. This is more the number side of things. And again, it doesn't work with spreadsheets. We have actually built, when I say we, I run a company called LeanStack. We've actually built a metrics modeler using these 7 metrics. You input these numbers into the tool, and it spits out a traction roadmap that looks something like this. Now, the power of a roadmap like this one is I can see a number of things. I can see kind of the size of an idea. So if I'm an investor, I can see that this team is aiming to hit $10 million of revenue in 3 years. And as an investor, to me, that's good news, because I want to invest in businesses that are going to give me a certain rate of return. If I'm a VC particularly, this is kind of the beginning of a good story. If they can really do this, then I'm interested in it. It's very different from a Excel forecast, because again, we're starting with a bottoms-up model. So you put a bunch of kind of assumptions on the table, and out comes out this model. I can also take this model down to 3 months, 12 months, 24 months, and then track how I'm actually doing against the model. I want to emphasize that this is not meant to be a model set in stone. Like your business model canvas, like your lean canvas, it can change. So when you first start out with an idea, you kind of throw some assumptions on the table. You come up with a model that maybe it matches your ambition, matches your investor's ambition, and that's how you get started. As you learn more information along the way, for instance, pricing, you may learn that you can charge more money for your product, or you have to go back and half the pricing of your product. You come back to the model and you kind of adjust it, and you can kind of get some new numbers here. So this model kind of goes alongside the Canvas model to kind of tell the number side of the story. And the reason that this is so important is that this code kind of summarizes, you can kind of read it, it's an adapted code from Alice in Wonderland, is that the reason it's so important is that even as entrepreneurs, if we don't know the size of what we are trying to do, then a lot of the tactics we use can be the wrong ones. I've seen many teams that are out interviewing a bunch of customers, and they keep interviewing customers when they are trying to build products that need to get to Facebook type scale. Facebook could not interview their way to 1 billion people. There's just no way that could happen. So there's nothing wrong with starting with some of those types of techniques like interviewing, but you have to recognize that very quickly you've got to build in certain engines of growth. You've got to build in certain channels. You've got to build in certain things that are going to get you there. I've seen also many teams that should be bootstrapping their products, should be self-funding their products, but they go into accelerators and they spend many months there. They get polite rejections from investors and they don't know why. So again, it's very important to understand the numbers in the early stages even, so that it can define the strategies that you use for validation. Ultimately, this is what we try to coach some of the teams that we work with at LeanStack for how to report on progress. So I love to see the Lean Canvas story. I want to see how that story is evolving. I want to see the experiments people are running, but I also want to see customers. So if in an extreme case, and I've seen this happen, I've seen teams that have gone and done lots and lots of learning. They have run hundreds of interviews. They have learned a ton. But when we look at their traction model, they haven't created that many customers, and they don't know how to create their next 10 customers, their next 20 customers. To me, that's a disconnect. So this again is not about following process to get a gold star or to get an A grade. I know many of you are doing this in a college setting, but we are trying to instill this idea of results over process. So the process is here to help, the process is here to guide, but you as entrepreneurs have to still be able to produce results at the end of the day. So again, this is the end of my rant on traction, but I want to emphasize it because in the real kind of investment world, very important to kind of bring in this number side of the story and talk about it even in the early stages. Talk about what traction is for you and be able to measure yourself against traction. And if week over week you can show traction, so even in the case of Airbnb, I'll use them as an example. In the early days, they had a very flat portion of the hockey stick curve, but they were still growing every week. In the beginning, they rented out their air mattress. It was just three rentals a week. But the following week, they were able to do 5, and then they were able to do 10, and they were able to do 20. So again, not lots and lots of numbers, not lots and lots of revenue, but that kind of continuous improvement in those early traction metrics is what gives your investors confidence and what gives you confidence of things working. So that's kind of why that's so important. It also helps you, as I said, understand the kind of tactics you use, but more importantly, understand how much of validation to do. One of the questions I often hear is, how many interviews should I run? Should I talk to 10 people? Should I talk to 30 people? Should I talk to 100 people? To me, the answer is you want to talk to just enough people to where you can make the traction kind of roadmap work in your particular case. So if that can be done with 20 interviews, then by all means, that's great. If it requires 100, then that's what you have to do. And as I said, if you're trying to get to scale beyond things that can be done with interviews, then you have to be able to replace interviewing with something more scalable, like say a Kickstarter campaign, or something more scalable like a landing page with ads. But there are all kinds of things that one can do, which I'll maybe show here in the last slide of kind of what all this process looks like. So I want to talk next about prioritizing risks. So what is this next step here? So and many of you know this, is that a lot of this process is really about trying to identify what's riskiest in the model. And when we talk about risks, it's helpful to think of it through these 3 lenses. If you have seen this, that's great. If not, you want to kind of try to look at your idea in terms of lenses of desirability, viability, feasibility. Anyone want to guess what might be the riskier of the three lenses? So when we are starting out in the early stages of an idea, which is the riskiest thing? Is it desirability, viability, or feasibility? Throw some answers out again in the chat window. Right, so William's saying viability. Anyone else? So I would say that all three, of course, are risky. We want to make sure that, so feasibility is, can we actually build this thing? The whole idea of viability is, can we make money, as you can see. I would often, so it is kind of a bit of a trick question, but I think that there's a slight ordering to this. And what we try to teach people is identify that many products fail in the world that we live in today, not because we can't build it. Given enough time, money, and effort, we can build things today. So feasibility is important, but we don't need to go overboard. We need to make sure that what we are trying to do can be done. Viability, again, is important. We want to make sure there's kind of monetizable pain associated with this. But what kicks off everything, to me, is really desirability. If your customers don't want what you have, then why would they even buy it? Why would they spend? Why would they even pay attention to you? That's what starts everything out. That's what starts everything. If you cannot get someone's attention with what you are doing, then the question of money doesn't even come across in the conversation. If the question of money doesn't even come across in the conversation, why even build this thing? So to me, I slightly say, I would say, as you can see, the sweet spot is still in the middle. You have to be at the intersection of all three things. But when you are looking at ideas in the very early stages, try to think of desirability first. What can you do that will get someone's attention, which is, again, goes back to the unique value proposition. What can you say that will stop someone in their tracks and say, what are you proposing? So if you can nail their problem, if you can describe a solution better than their existing alternative, that gets attention. If that gets their attention, they may then start considering switching from their solution to yours, and that's where monetization comes in. If you can get that far, then you start worrying about, can we actually build this? And of course, we have to think about, what we are trying to do. Is it even feasible? Because trying to promise vaporware, never works. But again, you have to bring in feasibility in the conversation, but you don't have to go overboard and build something to completion. So if you look at the lean canvas, this is the same reason why I will often look at these two quadrants first. So to me, problem, customer segment, that's what we're fundamentally trying to understand here. If you look at it from a logical perspective, if you don't have the right customer identified, if you don't have the right problem identified, that is like the foundation of your house. Everything else on the canvas comes crumbling down. So if you don't have customers and problems in order, the solution you build has no relevance because you're solving for nothing. Your channels don't matter because you can reach this customer, but the customer doesn't want to buy what you have because you're not solving a problem for them. They're not going to pay money. So as you can see, all of these boxes, like a stack of dominoes, just falls apart. And that's why when I look at the story that you'll be presenting, I want to see evidence of these questions, or I would say I want to see answers to these questions with evidence. So I want to identify, I want to understand who is your customer, and your customer is one who pays you. I want to identify how big is this customer segment, and of this big customer segment, where is the early adopter? Who are those early adopters? How do you identify them? How do you qualify them? Have you built channels to reach them? And then I want to understand the problems that you list a little bit more. I want to understand what are the problems, not of your mainstream customer segment, but of these early adopters. The more specific and narrow, the better in the early stages. If you look at examples like Facebook, Microsoft, Google, Apple, they all are massive billion-dollar companies today, very valuable companies, but they all started with a very, very small niche early adopter segment. And that's how they grew. So Facebook was not for everyone. It was just for college students. Microsoft were for techies. Apple was for creatives. They all started out in this very, very narrow segment, build a lot of success there, and then became the big companies that we know of. So I want to understand, again, what are those problems that your early adopters have? And then the last piece, very, very important, is how are they solving those problems today? Because again, if there's no evidence, and you can actually just use this quadrant to address feasibility, desirability, viability. So to me, desirability is, are you really solving something that people care about? And the way I know that is if you can point to an existing alternative, which is the bottom left-hand quadrant there. So how are they solving this problem today? If no one is trying to solve this problem today, it's probably not desirable. So I want to see evidence of what we would normally call competition. Then I want to understand, how much money are they spending on this competition? That's where viability comes from. If they're spending no money on the competition because it's a free solution, then that's bad news for you because you're going up against free. I've seen too many startups die because they go up against Google email, which is free, or they go against Google spreadsheets. So either Gmail or Google spreadsheets have killed more startups than other startups, in my experience. So we want to understand who are those alternatives. What are they? What do they cost? If they cost something, then that's where we can see evidence of monetizable pain. If they're free, you can still charge, but then you need to show evidence of how you kind of get over that. So to me, this is a quadrant I spend a lot of time on because this is a very, very key quadrant in the early validation. Finally, I want to talk about this last section here, and then we can open up for some questions. And this is about kind of testing. So as you can tell, a lot of the emphasis in this competition is going to be about validation over just the idea itself. So even though you can pitch and tell a very compelling story, you need to back that up with actual evidence. So it's very, very kind of geared around that. Now, when people often talk about the lean startup, there are two general things that come to mind: MVP and running experiments. And we generally think that if you can show an MVP at the end of the process, that's progress. Generally think that if you can run a lot of experiments and kind of show lots of loops around this build, measure, learn loop, that's a good thing. To me, it's not so much about quantity, but rather quality. So again, going back to the kind of traction idea, I would much rather see a team that has no MVP, but can actually show me a lot of de-risking of the business model. If you can show me that you have narrowed down on the customer segment, you have a problem, and you have used a proxy for the MVP, which is something we'll call the offer. I'll kind of define that here very quickly. But if you can show me that you can sell a product without an MVP, that to me is more powerful. And I think some of you know this, is that an MVP is not required at the end of the process. If you can get that far, that's great. But the process here is really more about trying to show de-risking of the business model from a business model perspective. The counterintuitive principle here is that you don't actually have to build a solution to get a customer. And the way that we do this is not by starting with an MVP, but starting with this thing that we call the offer. So here's a slide that kind of shows a number of different concepts, sometimes often misused. I'll start off with a definition, the definition that I kind of use for an MVP, because sometimes people use MVP very loosely. So I think we need to level set on what I mean by that first. But to me, an MVP is the smallest solution that you are building, giving to your customers that actually creates value for them, and then you get paid as a result. So this is an actual product. It's the release one of your product that you're giving out to your customers. For many of us, that takes time to build. It's not going to be right the first time around. And so there's a proxy for the MVP, which is this offer. And this is where we use things like demos, we use things like teaser pages, we use things like smoke tests, Kickstarter campaigns. All those are examples of offers. And we can use offers to actually test the MVP, to refine the MVP before we actually get to build it. So the last slide that I want to show you, it's going to be a bit busy, but this kind of shows the process that hopefully some of you have already been following and kind of understand. But it kind of shows a lot of the pieces that I talked about laid out in a more kind of linear, logical fashion. So on the far left, we have an idea. We kind of deconstruct it. Some of the first things we are trying to do is make sure that the idea represents a big enough idea. So that's where the traction modeling kind of comes in, if you're going to do that. But more importantly, that there is customer problem fit, that you are trying to solve a problem that a customer already has. If you're trying to invent a new problem, that's going to be bad news because it's very hard to convince customers of a problem that they do not have. People have tried, and that's kind of a new market situation, very, very hard to generally do. Not impossible, but harder to do. So that's kind of the first phase. The second stage over here is problem solution fit. So how do we now take the discovery, take the understanding of the problem that we have through interviews, through surveys, through focus groups? How do we take that learning and turn that into a solution? we don't have to build that solution. We can just build this offer, which is what you're seeing here. We can use the offer to really test for validation. So this, again, are those things like your landing page tests, and how much validation you need, again, will come from your traction roadmap. So this, again, is where I've sometimes had a hard time looking at ideas that say have 10 signups, or 10 email addresses, or 100 email addresses from a landing page. And without the traction roadmap, I don't know if that's enough. I don't know if that's too much. If you were trying to do a Facebook, 100 of anything is not enough. Facebook kind of launched on the whole college campus, got 10,000 students using it in 30 days. That's the scale that you need to be at if you're going to be playing in that game, in that league. So to me, very important to kind of use that as a way to define how much validation is enough. And so that's why the numbers kind of help in those instances. As you can see here, there's a loop. And so what you want to be doing here is not just brute forcing to an MVP, because we're not running a hackathon competition. This is more about business model validation. So you want to kind of show the pivots, you want to show the learning, you want to show decisions that you're making that are evidence-based, and that's what that kind of feedback loop is all about. So hopefully this slide makes sense. If it doesn't, we can kind of use the Q&A to kind of dig a little bit deeper. Some of the best pitches that I see is really telling a story about this process. So if you can kind of start at the very beginning, tell a little bit of backstory of where this idea came from, where you got started, and you've seen many examples probably on the website. Some of those do a very good job of that kind of storytelling. But injecting these artifacts and making it interesting with stories is what this is fundamentally about. So if you can tell a compelling story, break it into 3 acts, break it into 5 acts, however many acts that make your point. The point that what we want to see at the end of the competition is, how are you going from idea to traction, or going from idea to validation? What are the steps you've taken? How fast are you going? And what are you learning? How are you adjusting along the way? So creativity and MVP, creativity and offers, all of those things are things that get lots and lots of points. So finally, I'll just point out some resources that we have assembled and we are making available to all of you in the competition. So we do run a website. You may have seen that on the IBMC website, Lean Stack. This is where you can model your canvases and do some work there. But rather than just giving you an account and like everyone else, we've actually created a special area just for people participating in the competition, and we have unlocked all the features. So you can use everything that we normally charge our enterprise clients, per seat licenses for them to use. So we made that available to all of you. So use it if you want to. At a minimum, at least check it out to see if that's something valuable. You can get in there. You can do things like the Lean Canvas. You can play around with the metrics modeler. There are some videos that walk you through what this is. So if you want to go deeper on that, that's something that you have available to you. There's a whole library of content where we walk through a lot of those validation steps. So everything that I've been talking about here, this goes into just a lot more detail for how to do offers, different types of offers, depending on what you're building, how to do traction roadmaps. It kind of walks through many of those things. So kind of use that resource as you see fit. It's available for you. The link for that is on this page over here. So I know I've gone a little bit over time, but I'll stop now and kind of open up to any questions that you have. Thank you, Mick. So I see a question here from Matthew, and I'm fine. Kind of Jeff, Abigail, if there are other questions that have been asked, feel free to unmute and point them out. But I'm just going to go through what I'm seeing on the screen. So I see from Matthew Arnott, does the sexiness of the business, grocery good versus high tech, affect IBMC judging bias or general investor attractiveness, assuming similarly rated competitive angles relative to their industries? So I guess from my perspective, the answer is no. And if you even look at some of the examples that you'll see a wide array of businesses out there. Some are kind of really cool gadgets. Some are medical devices. All kinds of things that people come with. At the end of the day, this is a business model competition, not an idea competition. So It's not a popularity contest. So to me, it's more communicating, impact. So it could be a big enough idea. It could be whether it's impact driven, whether it's profit driven. Even to me, that doesn't matter, because both to me are equally hard to do. But that's what this is about: is how can we take an idea that's kind of big enough and then put it through the paces of validation. So that's how I'd answer that question. Yeah, so question from Yankee: how do you learn as fast as possible when you're relying on validations? Yeah, so the fastest way to learn is simply just to change your mind, right? You could wake up every day and change the canvas, but that's not really learning. That's, while that's a fast way to convince ourselves that we are pivoting and we're making all these decisions, they're not grounded in learning. They're just guesses. And unfortunately, that's a very fast way to change the model, but it's also a recipe for going around in circles. So to answer your question more directly, we advocate time boxing a lot of your experiments. So you want to go as fast as possible, but remember, fast is relative. So understand what market you're in. If you're in a digital marketplace, so if you're competing with other social media types of companies or other software service types of businesses, and there's going to be a certain cadence, there's going to be a certain pace that's going to be expected from the market. And you need to go at least as fast, and if not faster. So if you're trying to compete with Facebook, there's a famous quote from Mark Zuckerberg where they run 10,000 experiments a day. There are 10,000 versions of Facebook running at any given point. That is massive scale of validation. So they can come up with an idea, and in 4 hours, they could prove to themselves whether this is a good idea or a bad idea. So that's a huge unfair advantage they have, and that's the scale that they operate in. But if you're not operating at that scale, which most of us aren't, that speed doesn't matter as long as you're going faster than your competition. So if you look at a car company like Tesla, they launched a car in 2.5 years from idea to car, but along the way they were doing a lot of validations. They were testing for demand. They were sharing the idea. They were getting an email list going. They were doing price testing. They built a landing page. They went and talked to early adopters. They got down payments. All of this before the car was being built. And so compared to other car companies, 2.5 years to go from idea to a car being launched is going at light speeds. Typically, a car company to launch a new line takes at least 10 years. But these guys went way faster, and that's what this is about. So speed is all relative. And so the point that I want to raise here is that we want to emphasize speed, but we also want to emphasize that is relative to your market. So if you're a hardware company, if you're doing a physical product, the speed at which you're going to be going is going to be different than, say, a web-based product or a digital product. All right. Okay, other questions?
Ash, can you hear me?
Yes.
We have looks like we have another question from Mick. It says, if initial qualitative insights are promising, how much time do you advise to explore the size of the addressable market?
Yeah, so if we look at the validation process, it's really a two-phase process. So I'm a big fan of using qualitative to get the signals and the noise, because you want to make sure that what you are testing can get any traction whatsoever. And then we want to back it up with the quantitative. And so sometimes one simple way of doing this might be, people often ask me about surveys, and I tell them that surveys are not generally a good idea, in my opinion, for a starting tactic, simply because surveys require you to know what are the right questions to ask, and oftentimes we don't know what we don't know in the early stages. And so if you ask the wrong questions, if you ask bad questions, you're going to get bad answers. So we don't know how to design a good survey. And so it makes sense to do qualitative learning, which might be doing problem discovery, might be doing customer interviews. And so you learn the questions and you get some answers, and then you can design a better survey. So you might go and run 24 interviews and get some responses, and then you start kind of building some knowledge about what does this customer segment look like. Then you can design a survey and put that to scale. So to answer your question kind of more directly, think of it as a two-phase approach. The qualitative helps you find the signal and the noise, but then you still have to verify that with some quantitative kind of scaling afterwards. So if you look at the traction roadmap, you may get your first 10 customers, but then the next question I'm going to ask you is, how do you get your next 100 questions? Your next 100 customers. Think about 10xing your model. So it's not just about 10, 10, 10, but rather how do we go from 10 to 100? So how do we scale that qualitative learning into something more quantitative?
Ash, we had a question about your Lean Stack platform and how that would assist in assessing metrics needed to show the traction of the business, from Rayvon Stewart.
Yeah, so there is this was something that I learned, and I kind of touched on that a little bit, is that simply running a bunch of interviews and validation not enough. And actually, I've been in this mistake myself. In one of my ideas, I started out with this photo sharing product. It was the case study I described in my first book, Running Lean. I went out there, I found a market, I found a customer segment, they were willing to pay me money. And then six months later, maybe more like 9 months later, I kind of realized that the market was just too small for my ambition. For what I wanted to do, that was not going to be a good market. And I just spent 6 months, 9 months of my life doing a lot of validation. And that's what we sometimes call a local maxima. And that's why in the second book that I wrote, Scaling Lean, there's a big emphasis on doing some of the back of the envelope calculation up front. So the tool that we have allows you to kind of bring in those assumptions. So on your Lean Canvas, your business model canvas also, you're bringing in a lot of, as I said, qualitative assumptions about how does the jigsaw puzzle fit together from a business model perspective. The tool that we have allows you to then start playing with some questions. There's actually a wizard that walks you through a bunch of questions, like what is your minimum success criteria? So what kind of a minimum outcome are you trying to achieve? It talks about what is your pricing model, kind of what's your usage model, and it gives you some guidance for how to think through those things. But as you put those inputs into it, you answer these 7 questions, and out comes a model. Oftentimes, I found is that many of the starting models tend to invalidate an idea because, unfortunately, many of us entrepreneurs are like artists. We don't price our products well enough. We don't kind of think through churn and attrition, and that's what the tool helps you begin to see. So I just recommend playing with it. So again, you can kind of create an account there. When you do your Lean Canvas, there's a tab next to it called the Traction Roadmap, and there's a wizard that kind of guides you through these 7 questions. There are some videos that walk you through examples. So I model, I have a case study from a direct model, a multi-sided model, a marketplace model, Airbnb, Facebook, and then one of the product that I built. And it kind of shows you how to think through the numbers, and that will help you in thinking through kind of the metrics side of things.
All right, Ash, I think we've come to the end of that. Thank you so much for that amazing presentation. We have a number of people who have expressed that on the chat. I don't know if we have time for any other questions, but I would like to, if possible, just go back over some of the things that we went over at the beginning with the important dates to be focused on going forward. And then we will shut things down.
Sure. I'll put that slide up for you.
Oh, thank you very much. So again, thank you. A big not round of applause, but a big thank you for Ash. I'm not sure how you do a round of applause on this platform. But thank you so much, Ash. That was awesome. And here on the screen is some important dates for you to be aware of again. So the at-large round submission deadline, Saturday, March 30th, before 11:59 p.m. Mountain Standard Time, just again, a focus there on the time zone. And the fact that is open to any team competing in any competition at any accredited university, and not just IBM. You don't have to have competed in a qualifier competition to participate in the at-large round. So we will announce the winners on Thursday, April 11th. Then for those who win in that round, there will be pre-competition mentoring. We will provide that pre-competition mentoring for all of the teams that win and that are invited to the global event, global finals. The pre-competition mentoring for the at-large will happen from April 11th to April 25th. Then we will have an FAQ session on our Facebook account, Facebook page, and Facebook Live on Thursday, April 25th for specifically questions, more logistical questions about the competition and about your presentation things of that nature. And the global finals, we'll have a thought leader conference on May 9th and the competition on May 10th. And Ash, of course, will be one of our final event judges at that competition. So again, if you have other questions after this is over, please send them to businessmodelcompetition@gmail.com, and we can answer those. But otherwise, please go on to Ash's LeanStack platform. We really want to have you focus on using that to continue to validate, to work on your validation and actually track it inside of a platform. We have found that from other participants to be very valuable at using a platform to do that. I don't know, Ash, if there's any final things that you want to say, but again, just thank you so much for your time tonight.
Or no, I think from my end that's a wrap. I wish you kind of all the success, and as Jeff mentioned, feel free to check out the platform. There are a lot of resources in there, even just to reach out. So if you have questions, a little chat widget, and either myself or someone on the team are more than happy to kind of walk you through it, or even just kind of start to giving you, some guidance on how to make sense of what you're seeing there. So that's all I'll say, and look forward to seeing you at the competition.
One last thing I would say, Ash, is there were some questions about tonight's presentation. So obviously the slides are in the video. So Ash was recording both the video and audio of this presentation, and we will be posting it on our website. And so if you or anyone that you know would like to take advantage of this event tonight, please have them hit the website. That will probably be up within about a week or sooner. So again, thanks so much for coming tonight.
All right. Thanks, everyone. Take care.
We'll see you.